You know those stories that we hear and think, there's no way this really happened? Well, this is one of them, and I need to tell it because it left a huge impact on the lives of people that, one way or another, we end up meeting or hearing about. It all started on a day that looked like it would be just another day in the frenetic routine of Hugo Tavares, a guy who, in the eyes of many people, had reached the top. CEO of a startup worth billions, living in Rio de Janeiro, magazine covers and all that. But deep down, those who really knew him closely knew that his life was a mix of unbridled ambition, an almost unhealthy need for control, and a loneliness that not even the noise of success could drown out. It was a Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken, a typical Rio hot day, and he was there, stuck in the chaotic traffic downtown, with his head going 1,000 miles an hour, thinking about spreadsheets, goals, and who knows what else. That's when, on the other side of the street, waiting for a bus, he saw Marina. More than 5 years had passed, but it was her, and next to her, 2 little blonde boys, one more mischievous than the other, laughing and running around while she, distracted, played with her cell phone. Hugo's world, in that moment, stopped. It wasn't just seeing Marina after so long, it was the lump in his throat when he realized that the features of those boys were painfully familiar, a mirror of his own childhood. That image of the boys, so similar to the old photos his mother kept, was like a punch in the stomach, the kind that takes your breath away and makes you question everything. He told me, sometime later, that he felt his legs wobble, as if the hot asphalt beneath his feet had turned to quicksand. It wasn't just a coincidence, it was one of those tricks that fate throws at us and we can't ignore. Without thinking twice, driven by an urgency that he himself didn't quite understand, he opened the door of the luxury car, which was completely out of place in the popular bus stop scene, and crossed the street, almost being run over by a hurried taxi. Marina was startled to see him there, standing in front of her, out of breath. Her look was a mix of surprise, old hurt, and an almost palpable defensiveness. The conversation that followed there, amid the noise of the city, was one of the most tense and painful things imaginable. And in the midst of that whirlwind of emotions came the sentence that would change his life forever. "Yes, Hugo, Raphael and Davi are your children," she said with a choked but firm voice that she discovered she was pregnant right after he ended things, abruptly, and that she tried to warn him in every way. But he, blinded by the escalation of the company, had blocked any access, any bridge, and so she faced everything alone, from the morning sickness to the sleepless nights, with the baby crying. The impact of those words, "They are your children," was as if all the structures that Hugo had built over the years had collapsed at once, burying the relentless executive and revealing a frightened, lost man. There, on the dirty sidewalk, with the noise of the buses and the smell of smoke, he was nobody. The millions in the bank, the signed contracts, the important meetings, none of that mattered. What weighed heavily was time, the 5 years that he had not seen, known, or participated in. Imagining Marina pregnant, alone, going through all the difficulties while he was celebrating yet another achievement at the company, was a torture that tore at his soul. Guilt was a cold, sticky monster that settled in his chest, suffocating him. He looked at Raphael and Davi, who were now watching the scene with childish curiosity, oblivious to the earthquake that was happening between the 2 adults, and he felt a desperate, almost primitive urge to hug them, to tell them who he was, to try somehow to rewind the tape of life. With a choked voice, almost in a whisper, he begged Marina, not an order but a request from someone who is drowning and sees a lifeline. He asked for a chance, any chance, to meet the boys, to be close to them. Marina listened to Hugo's request with a heavy heart, a mixture of feelings that she herself could barely decipher. On the one hand, there was residual anger, the hurt of having been completely ignored when she needed it most, of having carried the burden of single motherhood with all its pains and pleasures, with no one by her side to share the bills. The fears, or the small victories. She remembered every sleepless night, every fever the boys had, every budget squeeze so that they would lack nothing. On the other hand, she saw there, in front of her, not the cold and calculating man who had discarded her, but someone who seemed genuinely destroyed by the revelation. His eyes, always so assertive and penetrating, were now moist, lost. She thought about her children, about the right they had to know their father, no matter how complicated the story was. After a silence that seemed like an eternity, she took a deep breath and, with her voice still trembling but firm, imposed her conditions. She said it would be little by little, calmly, and that to the boys he would initially be introduced as just a friend of Mommy's. It wouldn't be easy, she knew, but something in his desperation touched her. And so the meetings began, shy, strange, but with an undercurrent of emotion that filled the air. Hugo would arrive awkwardly, with a gift for each of them, trying to find a place in this universe that until then he had completely ignored. Those first encounters were like walking on eggshells for Hugo. He was used to leading meetings and dictating rules, but he found himself completely lost in front of those two little beings who were his blood and at the same time, complete strangers. He always arrived with a gift, usually chosen in a hurry by his secretary, and a weak smile that barely hid his nervousness. Conversations were rare and almost always mediated by Marina, who observed everything with a mixture of hope and apprehension. But little by little, very little by little, the ice began to break. They were small things. A curious look from Davy when Hugo was putting together a more complicated toy, an unexpected question from Raphael about the work of his mother's friend. And Hugo, clumsy, tried to answer, trying to find a way to talk to children, something he had never had to do in his life. His effort was visible, his desire to get it right. And perhaps this, more than any expensive gift, began to touch Marina and awaken a genuine curiosity in the boys. The meetings became more regular, almost a ritual at the end of the afternoon, 2 or 3 times a week, and Marina's small apartment, previously unknown and somewhat frightening territory for Hugo, began to have a minimally familiar air. It began to become clear to Hugo that Raphael and Davy were like water and wine, each with their own unique way of being and reacting to his presence. Raphael, the oldest by a couple of years, was clearly the family's guardian. He had a serious, observant look and would not be easily swayed by any easy favor. He would question everything, from why Hugo would visit them so often to whether he liked the same soccer team as his uncle. It was as if he was constantly testing that man, trying to decipher his real intentions, protecting his mother and brother from any possible new disappointment. Hugo felt the weight of the boy's distrust, but somehow he admired his attitude, so mature for his age. Davy, on the other hand, was the personification of spontaneity. More smiley, more in need of physical contact, he would quickly cling to Hugo's legs or ask to be held to show him a drawing. He was the one who brought an unexpected lightness to those encounters, with his funny jokes and his childish curiosity about the world. It was also through Davy, or rather Marina's constant concern for him, that Hugo began to realize that there was something more there, a vulnerability that went beyond his young age. Marina was overprotective of him, always paying attention to his breathing, his paleness, and this set off an alarm in Hugo's head. Marina's almost palpable concern for little Davy did not go unnoticed by Hugo for long. He began to notice her attentive glances at the boy during his more active games, the way she discreetly checked his breathing, the paleness that sometimes took over his little face after a greater effort. One day, Hugo arrived a little early for his visit and accidentally overheard a part of a tense conversation Marina had on the phone. Words like cardiologist, exams, and next appointment floated through the air and chilled his blood. Later, at a moment when Davy was sleeping peacefully on the couch after an afternoon of playing, and Hugo noticed how Marina covered him with an almost reverent care, he gathered the courage and asked. It was then that Marina, with tears in her eyes and a crack in her voice for the first time in front of him since the day of the revelation, told him about Davy's congenital heart condition. She explained the struggle she had had since birth, the hospitalizations, the routine of taking medication and the constant visits to the doctors, the fear that was her daily shadow. She told him how exhausting it was to deal with all of that alone, the financial worries about the costs of treatment, the fear that something worse could happen at any moment. Hearing that was another blow for Hugo, a mixture of helplessness and anger at himself for not being there, for not having shared this burden with her. That conversation about Davy's health was a turning point for Hugo. Fatherhood, which until then had been an abstract idea, a guilt to be atoned for, began to take on much more concrete and urgent contours. It was not just about getting to know his children, but about taking care of them, protecting them, and this realization began to completely disrupt his previously organized and predictable life. The first changes were subtle, almost imperceptible to those who did not know him intimately. A strategic meeting with international investors was rescheduled because an unforeseen personal matter had come up that could not be postponed. A business dinner, the kind that usually sealed million-dollar deals, was politely declined. At the office, the CEO's absence on some afternoons began to generate gossip and curious looks. He, who had always been the first to arrive and the last to leave, who had control over every detail of the company at his fingertips, now seemed to have his mind elsewhere, and he really did. His thoughts, previously filled with growth charts and profit projections, were now invaded by the boy's features. Davy's easy smile, Raphael's questioning gaze, and above all, the fragility of his youngest son's health. It was the beginning of a profound transformation. Hugo, the businessman, starting to make room for something he didn't even know existed within him, Hugo the father. Concern for Davy became a driving force for Hugo. He could no longer just watch Marina's struggle from afar. He began, timidly at first, to offer practical help. First, he discreetly researched the best specialists in the pediatric cardiac field, using his network of contacts that had previously been used only for business. Then he offered to take them to their appointments, a suggestion that took Marina by surprise. She hesitated, of course, accustomed to being self-sufficient and suspicious of any sudden change, but exhaustion and perhaps a spark of hope made her accept. And there was Hugo, the billionaire CEO, sitting in the waiting rooms of children's hospitals, his company cell phone silenced in his pocket, feeling butterflies in his stomach that no board meeting had ever caused. He felt awkward, unsure of how to act properly, but his presence, his willingness to be there, to listen to the doctors, to try to understand the technical terms, began to mean something. He started covering the costs of some more expensive tests and imported medicines, all done in a way that didn't seem like charity, but rather genuine support, which was a challenge for him, since he was used to solving everything with money, but he realized that it was different here. This new routine, which now included understanding medical prescriptions, medication schedules, and entire afternoons, dedicated to monitoring tests or simply playing in a playground while waiting for an appointment, was a completely alien universe to Hugo. He, who used to measure the success of his day by the number of emails answered or goals achieved, now found himself anxious for Davy's blood test to improve or for Raphael to smile at him. The afternoons in the playground, watching his children play, the sun shining on his face, the smell of wet grass, brought him a sense of peace that he had never found in the luxurious suites of five-star hotels or at the celebrations for closing big deals. It was a daily learning experience, exhausting at times, confusing at others, but that fulfilled him in a surprising way. Marina observed all of this with a look that mixed caution and a hint of admiration. Seeing this man, who had previously been so focused on himself and his own empire, dedicating his time and energy so completely to the boys, especially Davy, was something she never imagined possible. Her armor was beginning to show small cracks. As the weeks went by, which soon turned into months, Hugo's presence in the boys' lives stopped being a novelty and became a constant comfort. The label of Mommy's friend still existed, but in practice, the bond between them grew closer every day in an almost palpable way. Raphael, who had been so suspicious before, began to let his guard down. He shared his little frustrations at school with Hugo, asked for help with his homework, and even risked an awkward hug when saying goodbye. Davy, on the other hand, was all smiles and displays of affection. For him, Hugo was the perfect companion for imaginary adventures on the living room carpet and the best storyteller before bed, a role that Hugo discovered to his surprise that he loved to play. Hugo learned about their favorite heroes, the foods they hated, their nighttime fears. Small rituals began to be established, going to the playground on Saturdays, an improvised movie session on Sunday, afternoon with lots of popcorn. He was there, present, not just physically but emotionally, and the children felt it. Even Marina, although she still maintained a certain calculated emotional distance, found herself smiling as she watched the three interact. A lightness she had not felt for a long time. It was in the midst of this apparent calm, when a routine of affection and complicity was beginning to solidify, that unexpected news arrived to shake the foundations of that small family under construction. Marina, who had been searching for years for an opportunity for professional growth that would give her more financial security to raise her children, received a job offer she couldn't refuse. A large company in Lisbon, Portugal, offered not only an excellent salary, but also a career plan and benefits that would guarantee a much more stable future for her and her children. It was the opportunity she had always dreamed of, the way out of so many difficulties she had faced alone. Her eyes lit up at the possibility, at the prospect of offering a better life to Raphael and Davy. However, soon after the initial euphoria, a lump formed in her throat. She looked at her children, who at that moment were playing with Hugo in the living room, a scene that had become so common and beloved, and felt the weight of the decision. How could she, just now that they were finally building a relationship with their father, tear them away from there? The idea of interrupting that connection, so recent and still so fragile, was painful, but the opportunity in Portugal seemed unique. The news of Marina's job offer fell like a bombshell into the small universe that Hugo, Raphael, and Davy had built. In the days that followed, the atmosphere became heavy, full of uncertainty. Marina tried to appear excited about the opportunity when she spoke to other people, but Hugo could see the anguish in her eyes every time she watched the boys interact with him. The conversations between the two adults became more frequent but more difficult. Whenever the children were not around, they discussed the possibilities, the pros and cons of such a drastic change. Hugo, to his own surprise, did not react with despair or selfishness. The old Hugo, focused only on his own desires, might have tried to stop Marina, used his financial power to offer a counteroffer. But the Hugo transformed by fatherhood, even if only recently, thought first of his children, of the emotional stability they had just found. He saw the sparkle in Marina's eyes when she spoke of the opportunity, and he understood how much it meant to her, to their future. And at the same time, the idea of moving away from the boys again, of breaking that precious bond, was unbearable. It was during one of those nighttime conversations with a choked voice and a heavy heart that the most unlikely idea began to take shape. It was not a simple or obvious solution. It came about amidst much hesitation and palpable fear on both sides. After spending a sleepless night weighing all the variables, Hugo proposed something that initially left Marina speechless. He offered to stay with Rafael and Davi in Brazil, taking full care of them while she settled in Lisbon. The idea was that once she had everything organized there, housing, school for the boys, her own adaptation to the new job, they would re-evaluate the situation. Marina was shocked, entrusting her children, her entire life, to the man who had once abandoned her and who until a few months ago had not even known of their existence. It seemed crazy, but on the other hand, she saw the sincerity in Hugo's eyes, the genuine commitment he had been demonstrating. He argued that it would be the least disruptive for the children at that moment, allowing her to seize the opportunity without feeling guilty and for them not to lose contact with their father. After days of much thought, conversations with lawyers to formalize temporary custody and above all a lot of self-talk, Marina accepted. It was a leap in the dark for both of them, but also a testament to the journey they had traveled. Hugo felt a mixture of dread and iron determination. He could not fail. Marina's farewell at the airport was one of the most difficult moments Hugo had ever faced, perhaps even more so than many hostile boards of directors. Seeing Rafael and Davi's eyes brimming with tears, clinging to their mother's legs, while she herself struggled to hold back her tears, broke his heart in a way he never thought possible. Promises of daily video calls and the certainty of a reunion soon were small consolations in the face of the pain of separation. When her plane finally took off, Hugo found himself alone with two small children who, despite all their progress, still found their mother their absolute safe haven. The first few days were pure chaos. Hugo, used to having a team to manage every aspect of his life, now found himself having to deal with morning tantrums over breakfast, the difficulty of getting Davi to take his medication on time, the logistics of taking Rafael to and picking him up from school, and trying to maintain his professional routine, which had obviously gone out the window. There were notebooks to check, snacks to prepare, clothes to wash, an avalanche of household chores and responsibilities for which he was completely unprepared. He made every mistake imaginable for a first-time father. He burned the rice, forgot the date of Rafael's presentation at school, and felt like the worst man of all for it, mixed up Davi's medication schedule once, which caused him to panic and make a desperate call to Marina in the middle of the night in Lisbon. But in the midst of all this turmoil, something extraordinary happened. With each mistake, there was a lesson learned. With each difficulty overcome, a small victory. He discovered a patience he didn't know he had when he helped Rafael with a particularly stubborn math problem. He learned to make the macaroni and cheese that Davi loved so much, even though his first attempts were a disaster. He began to understand the unspoken language of his children. Davi's sad look when he missed his mother. Rafael's concern when he noticed Hugo was tired. The sleepless nights were compensated by a tight hug and an "I love you, Daddy," whispered by Davi before falling asleep, or by a knowing smile from Rafael when he saw that Hugo had finally managed to assemble that toy that seemed impossible. Little by little, the relentless CEO was disappearing, giving way to a present, dedicated, and above all, real father. Hugo's routine with the boys, although still full of daily setbacks and learning experiences, began to take on a rhythm of its own. He no longer felt like a tightrope walker, trying to keep all the plates in the air. There was a new ease, a confidence that was born of experience and growing love. Video calls with Marina were sacred, moments in which the four of them shared news, memories, and plans for the future. It was during one of these conversations when Davi, with the spontaneity typical of his age, asked why Uncle Hugo. They still called him that sometimes, out of habit, even though Marina had already explained that he was a very special friend who would take care of them, lived with them, and looked after them like a father. That Marina and Hugo exchanged a meaningful look through the screens. They had been talking about the right moment to tell the whole truth, and they felt that the time had come. There was no longer any room for delay, nor for half-truths in the face of the intelligence and sensitivity of the children. Raphael, in particular, already showed signs that he sensed something deeper in that relationship. The conversation was carefully prepared. Hugo and Marina decided that she would start the conversation during a video call, and he would continue in person, there, next to the boys. Marina, with the sweet and calm voice she always used to talk about important things with her children, began to explain that Hugo was not only a very dear friend of their mother, but someone even more special. She told them, in a simple and age-appropriate way, about the past, about how things don't always happen as we plan, but that love can find surprising paths. And then, with Hugo's heart beating wildly in his chest, she said the magic words, confirming what Raphael had perhaps already suspected, and what would be great and exciting news for Davi, that Hugo was, in fact, their daddy. Hugo watched their reactions. Raphael remained silent for a long time, his little eyes fixed on his, processing the information. Davi, on the other hand, smiled hugely and without hesitation threw himself into Hugo's arms, shouting, "Daddy, you're my real daddy." It was a moment of pure emotion, of contained tears, and of a truth that finally came to the surface to heal and unite. Davy's reaction, so spontaneous and full of joy, was like a balm for Hugo's soul, dispelling any trace of fear he might have had about that moment. He hugged his son tightly, feeling his little heart beat against his chest, and the tears he had been holding back finally came, not from sadness, but from relief and happiness that were overflowing. Raphael, however, needed a little more time. He didn't rush to hug him right away. He remained there, sitting, watching Hugo with an intensity that was only his. After a few minutes, that seemed like an eternity, he slowly approached and asked with a slightly choked voice, "So, you're not leaving anymore?" That question, so simple and so full of meaning, of all the childhood fear of abandonment, hit Hugo hard. He knelt down to be at the boy's height, looked him straight in the eyes, and with all the sincerity in the world, promised that no, he would never leave their lives again. He promised that he would be there, always. It was only then that Raphael allowed a small smile to appear on his lips and accepted his father's hug, a hug that sealed not only a discovery, but the beginning of a new certainty for him. That revelation, made with so much care and love, really changed everything. It was as if a missing piece in the puzzle of those children's lives had finally been put into place. The word "dad," previously a felt absence, now had a face, a smell, a safe embrace. Hugo felt the difference in his daily life, in the little things. The boys started calling him Dad, with a naturalness that warmed his heart. There was a new level of intimacy, of trust. Raphael began to share more of his thoughts, of his approaching pre-adolescent dilemmas, seeking his father's advice and opinion. Davi, if possible, became even more attached, wanting his presence in every discovery, in every new game. For Hugo, being called Dad by those two little voices was the most beautiful melody in the world. He felt complete in a way that professional success could never provide. The responsibility seemed to increase, but along with it came an even greater strength and dedication. He was no longer just the temporary caregiver. He was the father, with everything that word represented in terms of love, protection, and eternal commitment. Time flew by for Hugo, immersed in the intense and rewarding routine of being a full-time father. The months that Marina spent in Lisbon settling in were filled with video calls, photos, and little stories about everyday life that kept the connection between the four of them very much alive. And then, the day of her return arrived. There was a mix of anxiety and expectation in the air. The children were excited to see their mother again, but Hugo also noticed a new kind of security in them, a calmness that had not existed before. When Marina finally showed up at the arrivals gate, the reunion was emotional. Tight hugs, tears of longing, and lots of joy. But amidst the happiness, Marina also noticed something different. The children would run to her, but soon after they would reach for Hugo's hand, include him in conversations, and look at him with a familiarity and love that were undeniable. There was no longer mommy's friend or temporary caregiver. There was their father, a figure as solid and present as she was. It was clear to Marina in those first moments that the dynamic had changed forever and for the better. In the days following Marina's return, it became clear to both of them that returning to the previous arrangement with Hugo just visiting was unthinkable. The children now had two safe havens, two references of love and care. Raphael and Davi could no longer imagine their lives without their father's constant presence, and Hugo, in turn, could not imagine a single day without his children. Marina, with the sensitivity of a mother and the maturity of someone who has also undergone a major personal and professional transformation, realized that the best solution was not a choice between her or him, but the sum of both. Conversations about the future, previously tense and full of uncertainty, now flowed more lightly, with a common goal, the happiness and well-being of the boys. It was thus, naturally and consensually, that the idea of a true, flexible co-parenting system emerged, one that respected the children's love for both parents and the two homes they now had. They decided that the boys would spend time with her in Lisbon and time with him in Rio, adjusting according to their school needs and, of course, their wishes. It was a modern solution, perhaps unusual for some, but for that family it made perfect sense. The decision to become a co-parent brought new hope to everyone. It was as if a weight had been lifted from Hugo and Marina's shoulders, the certainty that, despite all the twists and turns, they had found a path that prioritized love and unity, even if in a different way than traditional. But there was one important step missing, something that for Hugo became an almost symbolic necessity, but with immense legal and emotional weight: officially recognizing Raphael and Davi as his children, giving them his last name. He talked to Marina about it, and she immediately agreed, understanding how much it meant to him and, above all, how much it would represent for the boys in terms of belonging and identity. It was not just a piece of paper or a legal formality. It was the materialization of a bond that already existed, strong and vibrant. In all their hearts, it was confirmation before the world that Raphael and Davi had a father who was present, who loved them, and who assumed all the responsibilities and joys of that condition. The process of legalizing paternity was simpler than Hugo had imagined, especially because there was consensus and a lot of will on all sides. He made sure the boys participated as much as possible, explaining each step so they could understand. When the new birth certificate finally came out, with Hugo Tavares's name there, next to Marina's name, as the father of Rafael Tavares and Davi Tavares, the emotion was indescribable. Hugo looked at those documents with tears in his eyes. They weren't just papers, they were proof that destiny sometimes writes straight with crooked, very crooked lines. For the boys, seeing their father's surname incorporated into theirs was a source of pride. Raphael, always more observant, commented with a discreet smile that they now had a full team name. Davi, more outgoing, went around repeating his full name to whoever would listen. That seemingly bureaucratic act sealed the new family configuration once and for all, bringing peace and security that were essential for co-parenting to flow with the ease and trust they so desired. It was the official recognition of a story of love, loss, and reunion that was just beginning to be rewritten. With all the ties duly formalized and hearts at ease, the Tavares family's new life began to take shape. A routine that defied geographical distances, but was stitched together with lots of love and technology. The boys' first season in Lisbon with Marina was a new experience for everyone. Hugo felt a tightness in his chest when he said goodbye to them at the airport. But this time it was different. There was the certainty of reunion and the happiness of seeing them set off on an adventure with their mother, who was thrilled with her new job and her new city. The video calls continued to be daily, and Hugo made a point of actively participating in their lives, even from a distance. He helped with their homework virtually, listened to stories about Rafael's new Portuguese friends, and followed every little development in Davy's speech and drawings. He even started learning a few words in Portuguese from Portugal to surprise them. Hugo's company, once the center of his universe, now adapted to his new reality as a present father, even if, at times, that presence was through a computer screen, thousands of kilometers away. When it was time for the boys to return to Brazil for their stay with Hugo, they were overjoyed. The apartment in Rio, which had previously been the home of a lonely executive, was now a true family home, with toys scattered around, drawings stuck on the fridge, and the constant noise of children's energy. Hugo struggled to balance work with caring for his children, and discovered that he was much more productive and focused when he knew he had a set time to pick them up from school or to prepare dinner. Marina, in turn, also took advantage of these stays to visit Brazil, catch up with family and friends, and of course, spend quality time with her children and even with Hugo, in a relationship that evolved into a respectful and complicit friendship. They became true partners in raising the boys, making joint decisions, sharing joys and worries, and ensuring that Rafael and Davy felt that they had two parents who were entirely dedicated to them, regardless of the continent they were on. This dance between Rio and Lisbon, although tiring at times, worked because the main pillar was the unconditional love for children. The times Rafael and Davy were with Hugo in Rio were filled with a normality he never dreamed could be so rewarding. Waking up early to prepare breakfast, rushing to catch up on school, arguing about which cartoon to watch on TV, trips to the supermarket that turned into expeditions filled with requests for treats. Hugo, the man who had previously only known the taste of hotel breakfasts and dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, now delighted in the buttered bread he shared with his children and the slightly burnt pasta he prepared himself under the watchful and critical eyes of the young chefs. He learned the importance of a good-night kiss, of a story told at the foot of the bed, of the comfort of a hug after a nightmare. Little things that, for the old Hugo, would have been insignificant, but for the new Hugo were the essence of happiness. He saw the world with different eyes. His priorities had been completely redefined. The glow of a new contract signed at the company was nothing compared to the glow in Davy's eyes when he managed to ride a bike without training wheels for the first time, with his help and encouragement. This transformation did not go unnoticed by those around Hugo. His partners and employees, who had previously been accustomed to a ruthless and often distant boss, now saw a more human, more understanding and, surprisingly, more inspiring leader. He remained a competent executive, but his former obsession with control and excessive ambition had given way to a more balanced view of life. Hugo discovered that it was possible to be successful professionally without sacrificing emotional ties, without giving up the joy of watching his children grow up. The walls of his office, previously decorated with awards and performance charts, now displayed colorful drawings of Raphael and David, true works of art that to him were worth more than any Picasso. He relearned to smile more often, a genuine smile that came from the soul and that reflected the inner peace he had finally found. The emotional loneliness that had plagued him for so long had been filled by the unconditional love of his children, a love that healed, transformed, and gave new and true meaning to everything. The months went by in this rhythm of sharing and rediscovery, with the children blossoming under the joint care of Marina and Hugo. And then, an important milestone began to approach, a date that for Hugo carried immense symbolism: Raphael and Davy's birthday. It would be the boys' 6th birthday, but the first that he would celebrate with them as a father. The date would coincide with one of their seasons in Rio, and Hugo felt an urgency to make that day unforgettable, not with expensive gifts or an extravagant party that his bank account could easily provide, but with meaning, with the presence and love that he had denied them for so long, even without knowing it. He began planning everything weeks in advance, involving the boys themselves in the choices. He wanted it to be something simple, intimate, but that reflected the joy of this new moment in their lives. He talked to Marina via video, sharing ideas, and she, even from afar, participated enthusiastically, happy to see Hugo's genuine commitment to providing a special day for his children. The anticipation for the birthday party was palpable. Raphael, now older, helped Hugo make the list of a few guests, some school friends, and his maternal grandparents who had also warmed up to him again. Davi, on the other hand, was more interested in the theme of the party, superheroes, of course, and mainly in the chocolate cake that he insisted on ordering from the bakery on the corner, his favorite. Hugo found himself smiling to himself as he thought about all the details, from the color of the balloons to the games he would organize. For him, that small celebration in his apartment represented much more than a birthday. It was the materialization of his redemption, the celebration of the family he didn't even know he had, and that was now the center of his universe. He wanted every detail to exude love, for the boys to look back years later and remember that day, not for the ostentation, but for the feeling of unity, for the joy of being together, and for the certainty of how much they were loved, both by their mother, who would be present via video, and by their father, their body and soul. Finally, the big day arrived, bathed in a radiant sun that seemed to bless the celebration in Rio de Janeiro. Hugo's apartment, normally so executive and minimalist, was unrecognizable, transformed into a true children's party room, albeit improvised. Colorful balloons competed for space with the children's drawings, proudly displayed like works of art on all the walls. A simple table, but full of sweets, snacks, and, of course, the long-awaited chocolate cake with candles for number 6 was the center of attention. Raphael and Davi ran from one side to the other, dressed in their superhero costumes, excitement written all over their little faces. Hugo, with a smile that barely fits on his face, welcomed his few little friends and maternal grandparents, feeling a genuine joy that he had not experienced so intensely for a long time. He had taken the risk of making some of the sweets himself, following tutorials on the internet, and the result, although not aesthetically perfect, carried the special flavor of effort and affection. At the height of the party, with the children engrossed in the games that Hugo had organized with surprising dedication, he positioned the laptop so that Marina could participate in everything directly from Lisbon. Her image, smiling and sending kisses on the screen, completed the scene. They sang Happy Birthday with a mix of voices in person and Marina's voice echoing through the computer, and emotion took over everyone. Davi, when blowing out the candles, looked at Hugo with those bright eyes and said, with the cutting sincerity of children, "This is the best birthday in the world, Daddy, because you're here." Raphael, more reserved, just held Hugo's hand tightly, in a gesture that said more than 1,000 words. At that moment, surrounded by the happy noise of the children, the smell of cake and the presence, physical and virtual, of the most important people in his life, Hugo felt an overwhelming clarity about what happiness really meant. It had nothing to do with his company's performance charts or the balance in his bank account. While the boys opened their presents with contagious euphoria and the guests helped themselves to another slice of cake, Hugo stepped back for a moment, leaning against the doorframe of the balcony, just watching the scene. The afternoon sun came in softly, illuminating the dust that danced in. The air, along with the children's laughter, It was a simple image, almost banal for many, but for him it was the purest and most powerful representation of happiness. He remembered so many other successful moments in his life: graduating with honors, the first startup sold for a fortune, the magazine covers, the dinners at trendy restaurants where he felt like the king of the world. And yet, none of those moments, no matter how grandiose they seemed at the time, compared to the genuine emotion he felt now, with his heart warmed by the simple presence of those two boys who were his sons. He realized with a clarity that was so real it was painful, how poor he had been in the midst of so much wealth, how emotionally empty his relentless pursuit of more power and more money had left him. There, watching Raphael patiently explain the rules of a game to a little friend, and Davy laugh with his mouth stained with chocolate as he tried to put a party hat on his grandfather, Hugo understood that true success was not in the numbers in a bank account or in public recognition. It was in the bonds built, in the love shared, in the ability to give and receive affection without reservations. It was in the eyes of his children, who now looked for him in the middle of the party and, upon finding him, smiled knowingly, full of love and trust. It was the certainty that he belonged there, to that family, in a way that he had never belonged to any board of directors or any elite social circle. The ambitions that had previously driven him seemed distant, almost insignificant, replaced by a much deeper and truer desire to be a good father, a safe haven for those two beings who had turned his life upside down in the best way possible. And he knew with every fiber of his being that he would never leave again, that his place was there, by their side. The boys' birthday party ended up becoming a milestone, not only for Hugo, but for the entire small constellation of people who orbited around that family. The maternal grandparents, for example, who had previously viewed Hugo with understandable distrust, now embraced him with genuine affection, witnesses to the transformation of that man, and most importantly, to the happiness of their grandchildren. Marina herself, even though she was participating from afar, felt immense peace when she saw that her children were supported and loved on all fronts. That simple celebration, but full of affection, was like the end of a phase of much pain and uncertainty, and the beginning of a chapter in which the word family took on a broader, more resilient meaning. Those who followed it closely, or even those who only heard the stories, realized that there are no magic formulas for happiness, nor perfect scripts for life. Sometimes it is in the midst of chaos, of the most unexpected twists and turns, that we find our true place in the world, and that is exactly what happened with Hugo. After that birthday, their lives continued on their own, with the dynamics of co-parenting becoming increasingly smoother. Traveling between Rio and Lisbon became part of their routine, and the boys took to it with ease, adapting with impressive ease, perhaps because they felt the security and unconditional love of both parents, regardless of where they were located. Hugo continued his journey of learning how to be a father, stumbling here and there like everyone else, but always with an inspiring dedication. He was never the same man again. That shell of a cold and calculating executive had been shattered forever, revealing a more sensitive, more empathetic and, incredibly, happier human being. The people who knew him before and after this turnaround had a hard time believing that he was the same person. It was as if his encounter with fatherhood had unlocked a part of him that not even he knew about, a capacity to love and give of himself that had been dormant. And the strangest thing is that this transformation seemed contagious, inspiring others around him to rethink their own priorities. The years that followed were surprisingly stable, considering the whirlwind that had been the beginning of it all. Raphael and Davi grew up to be smart, well-adjusted teenagers, moving between the two cultures, Brazilian and Portuguese, with a naturalness that was enchanting. They carried the mixed accent, the slang from both sides of the Atlantic, and most importantly, the certainty that they were loved by parents who, even though they were geographically separated most of the time, worked as a cohesive and dedicated team. Hugo and Marina maintained their respectful friendship, a partnership that went far beyond the practical issues of raising children. They shared confidences, asked each other for advice, and occasionally even spent vacations together, the four of them, like a modern and somewhat unlikely family, but one that worked wonderfully. Anyone who saw them like this, interacting with such ease and complicity, could hardly imagine the wounds of the past. But it was precisely these scars, now healed, that gave an idea of the strength of their bond. The news that comes out about them from time to time is always the best possible. Hugo, although still at the helm of his company, has found a balance that previously seemed impossible. He has delegated more, traveled less for work, and learned to say no to commitments that would take him away from his children or his own leisure time. It is said that he discovered a talent for gardening on the weekends and that his business meetings became more objective because he always had an urgent personal commitment at the end of the afternoon, which usually involved picking up his children from some activity or simply being home for dinner. Marina has also established herself professionally in Lisbon, building a successful career, but without ever giving up being the present and dedicated mother she has always been. She and Hugo have become a silent example of how love and forgiveness can rewrite stories, transforming deep pain into the foundations for a happier and shared future. And that's how things settled down. No more dramatic twists, no big announcements or spectacular events. Their lives, Hugo's, Marina's, Raphael's and Davi's, simply continued, each at their own pace, but intertwined by that invisible and unbreakable thread that fate, in a very twisted way, wove. Hugo was never the same man. Again, that's a fact. That late and unexpected fatherhood was the turning point he didn't even know he needed. The boys grew up, of course, and today they must be young men following their own paths, but with that solid foundation of love and belonging that made all the difference. Sometimes we wait for a grand ending, and they lived happily ever after in so many words, but real life is rarely like that, right? It just goes on, with its ups and downs, with its silent joys and its daily challenges. What remained of this whole story, for those who knew the details, was the feeling of having seen something truly significant happen, one of those rare combinations of events that change lives irrevocably. There was no magical explanation for how everything fell into place in the end, nor a moral lesson ready to be learned. It was just life happening, with its pains, its surprises, and its impressive ability to reorganize itself. And so, like someone turning a page in a book that left a deep impression, their story continued its course, leaving in the air that feeling that sometimes the most extraordinary things happen when we least expect it. And then, simply, the dust settles and life goes on, transformed, but it goes on.